Hi, my name is Bethany Powls, and my thesis project, as funded by the URICA committee, is titled From Nursery to Narnia, Ideal Girlhood in 19th-Century Children's Literature and C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And this project was the culmination of two majors, my history major and my English major, both which required a significant scope for competency. And the title then covers my historical analysis of 19th century children's literature and also my literary analysis of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So my thesis, my argument of study that I seek to prove in this paper is as follows. The written tenets of Romanticism and elevated Victorian virtues, though altered according to cultural expectations for children, or more specifically, girl children, were grounded in the historical imposition of appropriate child behavior by adults, producing the moral, imaginative, instructive, and popular children's literature of the 19th century. So Lewis's position as both an author and a lay theologian lent him to sort of a traditional moral imitation of these tendencies, copying those who initially connected children, particularly girl children, with innocence and divinity, an inclination toward nature, and in need of imaginative and moral examples. Thus, this is the major part, writings for children depicting children as produced by the Romantic movement and the Victorian period perpetuated an ideal standard of appropriate conduct, innocence, morality, and connection to the divine in girl children, which is then emulated in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe through his portrayal of children and Narnia itself. And this three-point analysis covers a century and some. And I start with the early 1800s, leading into the 1830s with a quick discussion of Romanticism and the creation of this ideal child. And then I move into the Victorian era with the explosion of publishing in the area of children's literature, where they emphasized behavior and nursery spaces more, especially for girls. And I use all of this to study Lewis's adoption of 19th century themes and structures for creating his own standard of an ideal child. So the Romantic period of English society started before the 19th century and carried over into the 1830s and really placed a new emphasis on some literary themes that included emotional expression, intense imagination, and a greater sense of appreciation for nature in collaboration with some sort of divine influence. And all of this boiled down to using these tenets to prove some sort of morality. And writers of the time believed it was important to integrate these values at a young age by sort of quote unquote establishing this inherent system of values. And thus children became idealized in literature. And so within writing at this time, there are two primary kinds of stories that were directed at children that inform this history of children's literature: the moral tale and the fairy tale. And the moral tale was more didactic. It was prompted by the English government during a time where literacy made for presumably better citizens. And it was in the interest of this developing literacy that the Sunday school movement arose, in which the masses were taught how to read the Bible. And for the fairy tale, this was new and presented morals as entertainment, primarily. And the movement in general was rather late, England specifically, which is where I focus, as compared to the rest of Europe. And while the moralizers still ran the market by the 1830s, fairy tales were popping up all over the place starting in the 1810s and were very popular in romantic circles because they were more symbolic and metaphorical, which these romantic writers really enjoyed. And they stimulated the imagination, which they thought was very important for children's literature. And so then the English attached this tradition of moralizing to fairy tales, which synthesized them as a sort of pedagogical form of entertainment that wasn't quite as outrageous as, say, the fairy tales of their German or French counterparts. So by the time then that the fairy tale became more popular, the ideal child was then fully visible and fully known and fully acknowledged by society. Children in literature were often isolated for the purpose of appropriate child development, because the alternative was exposure to society's corrupting influence. And so this is a rather apparent contrast in a lot of popular fairy tales where the adult is the antagonist and the protagonist is a child. Society essentially endangered these quote unquote psychological powers that I have listed here in my paper, such as idealism, holism, animism, things like that. And girls especially became more prominent in these stories as they were considered among the purest of the pure. And by the 1830s, you also begin to see the appearance of the redemptive or the extraordinarily virtuous girl, which served to give girl children a sort of equal footing with their generally more adventurous boy counterparts. And one of the stories that I felt encompassed this so well is Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen, published in 1844, whose characters are quite similar to those of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobes. In a brief summary, the primary character, a little girl named Gerda, loses her childhood friend Kay to the antagonistic Snow Queen as he succumbs to her power, abandoning all sense of emotion, compassion, and virtue. And for the sake of time, again, the summary is that Gerda must then journey to recover her friend, overcoming her own trials and proving herself virtuous in the end, in addition to recovering Kay to his natural state, his natural emotional, imaginative state. And if this isn't emblematic of early 19th century writing, then I don't know what is. And the English absolutely adored Andersen's writing. So this plot and things like it became very imperative to the culture of children's publishing. So society during the Victorian era, which came later, the mid-1800s to the late 1800s and into the 1900s, this society revolved more around print culture. It was more capitalistic, and there was an emergence of a middle class as a result. And the domestic sphere was created during this time, which negotiated the argument that a woman should never leave the incorruptible and ultimately moral space of the home, which would influence then the perception of girlhood as one that had to one day uphold the purity of this sphere. This is in part one of the reasons why nurseries became so popular during this time. And the golden age of children's literature formed then as a result of the separation of childhood as an entity and the value that was placed on their development, in addition to this mass explosion of publishing for children during this time. And some of the ways in which Victorian children were portrayed in books directly connects to the Romantic period and this need for childhood separation and preservation, which largely arose from a changing society. The inclusion of secluded gardens and other worlds is reflected in stories like Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland, where children are magicked off to some other realm. And the mortality rate for children of this time, though not specifically middle children, was considerably higher. So in a lot of these fantastical stories, and even stories that are based more in reality, death and suffering is a very prominent theme. Because it represents a sort of purifying process, exposing child readers to the very reality of death. Additionally, inappropriate behaviors are often condemned, like vanity and dishonesty. Those are consistently the ones that I stumbled upon, as they were not befitting for middle-class children who would one day either enter the domestic sphere or represent their family in the industrial sphere. Inappropriate behaviors like an active imagination, innocence, and virtuous behavior toward others, particularly the immediate community, were emphasized, especially for girl children. And also at this time, specific manuals were being written for girl children, and they were called conduct manuals, which were meant to inform future women on the appropriate way to behave and place a lot of emphasis on right behavior and compassion for community in addition to family. And then again, this emphasis on more domestic things like femininity. So the girl in Victorian literature was particularly fascinating because she was such an ambiguous figure. And the Victorians didn't really have a very clear classification of a girl. Was she a woman or was she a child? Literary scholar Thomas Fair wrote a very interesting article on the balance established between domestic expectations for literary girls and the inclusion of adventure and things that were generally more entertaining for these children. And he insisted on the existence of a Robinsonade type that is more capable of going on adventures and having a generally more curious attitude, and was also capable of nurturing others, upholding virtuous and moral behaviors as sort of the feminine and domestic alternative to a Robinson Crusoe figure. Additionally, this idea of the redeeming daughter became a standard in Golden Age literature as well. and figured a sort of girl that exhibited these virtuous qualities in contrast to either the corruptibility of adults or their male counterparts, as in the example of Kay in The Snow Queen. And the redeeming daughter was often vindicated by the end of the story as the true heroine of the tale in this sort of exemplary moral example. And I found this a lot in children's literature from the time of Anderson's writing and into the later 1800s, and especially in the famous writings of author George MacDonald, who was writing about the mid to late 1800s. And he happened to be a very favorite writer of C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis actually read a lot of his stories later on in his childhood. And MacDonald's girl children were often represented as incredibly noble and innocent, as contrasted with other characters whose poor behavior identified them as snobbish, ill-mannered, dishonest, or vain. And this was particularly true in his representation of a character that I studied from his book, The Princess and the Goblin, 8-year-old Princess Irene. And in this book, she really blends this idea of domestic comfort with adventure, as she and her comrades go on this goblin slaying adventure. And this leads them to the final conclusion of the book, in which her position as a princess is maintained and her innocence as well. And so Lewis was an enormous fan of both Anderson and MacDonald, and so imitated them in addition to other themes presented by the 19th century in his own unique children's literature. Which brings me to my discussion and analysis of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where I follow these themes and trends that carry over from the 19th century. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't know who this man is, at least by association with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the Chronicles of Narnia. However, his life and personal development really influenced his writing, in addition to his education and his faith. He was a World War I vet, and that experience itself influenced his beliefs incredibly. He read a lot of 19th century literature during the war and emerged from it as a sort of romantic himself. And after launching his career as an avid academic in the 1920s and 30s, in coalition with both Oxford and Cambridge universities, he soon became active in writing about Christianity specifically after his recent conversion. And most of his published works are then apologetic-based reads for adults specifically. And he was largely inspired by the Inklings, which was a literary society formed during his time at Oxford, including other famous writers like J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote the Lord of the Rings. And the group generally promoted Romanticism as a whole, and they were, quote unquote, I love this quote, politically conservative, religiously reactionary, and generally hostile toward modernism in the arts, which I found a rather amusing description of them. They also coined terms like romantic theologians, referring to themselves as ones whose theological beliefs could best be expressed through the use of imagination, and literary belief, which essentially gave a name to what both the Romantics and Golden Age writers were trying to accomplish in their writing, that imaginative tales for children would be the best avenue for which to impart moral messages through symbolism or metaphor. And overall, women and children were generally well respected by the group, if not relegated to the same sort of standards that had been implemented in the 1800s. They were not modern men, but the antagonism that many modernists like to claim exists in their writings is simply not antagonistic, but is just a more, as they would have called it, chivalrous traditional way of viewing both women and children. And all of this history is richly reflected in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And as a brief premise to the story, it focuses on the journey of 4 siblings, the Pevensies, as they are evacuated to a country estate during the London Blitz during World War II. Very like the child refugees that Lewis himself offered sanctuary at his estate, Kilns. During their time at the manor, the youngest, Lucy, discovers a wardrobe that becomes a secret passage to another realm, Narnia, which launches this adventure in which the children must face antagonists like the villainous White Witch and a never-ending winter in order to assume their rule as kings and queens of this land, with notably the assistance of a sort of Christ-like allegory in the form of Aslan the lion. And Lewis really meant for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and his other children's stories to be perceived as both moral tale, and fairy tale because he implements messaging through symbolism, but also really enjoyed the flexibility that the fairy tale genre afforded him. He was able to, in the tradition of Neverland and Wonderland, fashion a world for his children away from reality as a sort of magical nursery in which the romantic and behavioral elements could be fostered without the corrupting influence of the real industrial war-ridden world. And as a side note, this was actually inspired by a series of refugees, again, that Lewis himself would house at Kilns, suggesting that he was very conscious of child development and felt that Christianity played a large role in their development, as evidenced by his incorporation of religious symbolism in his text through figures like Aslan. And because of Lewis's connection to Romanticism and the Golden Age, he most definitely elevates the Pevensey children as his primary ideal children. There is a sharp contrast between moral characteristics, often exemplified by Lucy, and immoral characteristics, often exemplified by either the White Witch or the second youngest child, Edmund. And in almost every situation, the immoral characteristics of dishonesty and vanity and the like are associated with adulthood or rationality, pulling in this idea of the necessity of childhood separation. But even more than her siblings, Lucy is really elevated as the primary example of both romantic childhood, proper girlhood, and the elevation of innocence and morality. Thus, Lewis joins the conversation of the 19th century. What do we do with girl children, and how do we write about them in a way that's meaningful and impactful? And Lucy achieves this wonderful sort of balance, the kind that Thomas Fair's Robinsonades would be proud of, I think. She is excessively adventurous and curious, as it is her own discovery that instigates this journey for the children, one that she fully embraces that involves quite a lot of danger. And yet she is still domestic, concerned with things like cooking and clothing, and is generally compassionate and nurturing for her immediate community. One of my favorite moments in the story is when Father Christmas, another magical figure, when he's handing out gifts to the children, presents Lucy with a vial of healing liquid, essentially enabling this rather traditional idea of the nurturing feminine, which becomes crucial to the salvation of her brother Edmund at the end of the story. This, I felt, tied in quite nicely with the role of Gerda in saving Kay from the Snow Queen, and was an interesting parallel between the two stories. Lucy is compassionate, forgiving of those who treat her poorly, and is quick to respond with a thoughtful, intelligent, and well-mannered sort of behavior in tense situations, which Lewis really prioritized. Additionally, she is hailed, I would say, most importantly, as the spiritual leader of the story, as it is she who connects the most with Aslan through her immediate presence at his death and her own emotionally inspired reaction to his power, even in later books in the series. And it is she who first guides her siblings to their destiny as kings and queens, in addition to guiding them to Narnia itself. And so in conclusion, I wanted to take a quick look at Lewis's dedication in the front of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as addressed to his goddaughter, Lucy. And he says, "I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. And as a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again." And this, I think, captures Lewis's own perspective on this idealization of childhood. He obviously cared about the sort of stories his goddaughter was reading and felt that it was important for her, even as an adult, to have imaginative tales in her life. And I think this connects to the sort of sentimentality that I found in a source of mine written by a Holocaust survivor, which is completely relevant to the time that Lewis was writing, who makes the claim that the sentimentality of the 19th century directed at children, particularly at girl children, and this idealization of childhood and all of its perceived innocence is the antithesis to the horrors of the 20th century and the more modernist way of coping. And Lewis's own writing of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe connects him then extensively to writers of children's literature during the 19th century through the sentimentality for childhood and a concern for the implementation of values and childhood behavior, both as they influence later adulthood, thus improving society, and as they would serve to entertain while moralizing, firmly establishing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a standard of children's literature. And before closing, I would like to quickly thank the Eureka Committee for the grant that helped so enormously with the research aspect of this project, which was very long and extensive, and for my primary advisor of the project, Brad Bourne, as well as the other faculty of the History and English departments. They made all the difference in the world. And additionally, I'd like to give a big shout out to my family and friends for their support and their encouragement through this process, and also for tolerating all of my excited rants about this research process. So, thank you.